Don't even bring that rust bucket out here, Walt. You'll embarrass yourself. Brett Hollis said it before Walt Briggs's farmall had even stopped rolling. The engine's steady thrum carrying across the wet field like a heartbeat that does not know it is supposed to be embarrassed. 6 modern machines sat buried to their axles in Ford County clay, gray mud sealed around their tires like concrete. And the only thing moving under its own power was a tractor that was built when Harry Truman was in his first term. The laughter cracked through the cold air like ice giving way. 2 sales reps behind Brett exchanged a look, the knowing kind, the kind that says we already see how this ends. A hired hand shook his head slowly. Len McGuire stood off to the side with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the sky. Walt Briggs was 73 years old. Canvas jacket, the same one from last October and the October before that. The tow chain was already coiled on the hitch. He had the look of a man who had come to do a specific job and was mildly interested in the opinion of the man trying to stop him from doing it. Brett stepped into the farmall's path. One hand raised. That thing hasn't pulled anything heavier than a plow since Reagan was president. You'll bury it. But what Brett Hollis didn't know was that Walt had rebuilt the farmall's rear differential 2 Saturdays ago and had been watching the October weather forecast since the first week of September. 6 machines, all of them modern, all of them stuck. One 71-year-old tractor with a man who knew exactly what it could do. Do you know that feeling when someone has been laughing at the one thing that still works, and the moment finally arrives when the laughing has to stop? Let's go back 52 years to the morning Walt Briggs paid $400 for a machine everyone else had already given up on. October 1971, Ford County, Illinois. Walt is 21 years old and has $400 in cash from 2 summers of detasseling corn. The kind of work that leaves your hands cut and your shoulders aching and your pocket actually full for the first time. The farmall M is sitting in a neighbor's shed, a man named Clarence who is 78 and can no longer keep up with a farm that size and is selling everything to his son-in-law except the things the son-in-law does not want. The farmall M, engine seized, paint faded to a chalky red, is not something the son-in-law wants. Walt's father drives out with him to look at it. His father walks around it twice, taps the hood with one knuckle the way a man checks a melon, and says, "This is a project, Walter. You understand that." Walt says, "I know what it is." His father looks at him for a moment. $400 is a lot of money to pay for a project. "I know," Walt says. He pays the $400. What his father didn't know, what no one watching would have known, was that Walt had already read the engine specification through a library, manual, and had driven to visit a retired case dealer named Ed Horrigan in Rantoul, who had worked on the Model M for 15 years and who spent 2 hours one Saturday afternoon explaining the engine's weak points and its strengths to a 21-year-old who showed up at his door with a notebook and asked good questions. Walt knew what was wrong with the farmall before he bought it. He knew what it would take to fix it. He bought it because it was fixable and because he understood the machine, which is a better reason to buy something than most people use. He spent that first winter in his father's equipment shed with a library manual and Ed Horrigan's phone number, and a patience he had inherited from a family that did not replace things before they understood why they had failed. By spring, the engine ran. Not perfectly. There was a governor issue that took another 3 months to sort, and the hydraulic pump seal needed replacing twice before Walt got the right part from a supplier in Peoria. But it ran. By 1975, it ran better than it had left the factory. This was not luck. This was what happened when someone who understood a machine spent 4 years learning its specific interdependencies. Every weakness anticipated, every vulnerability preempted. Walt kept a handwritten log in a yellow legal pad notebook. Every repair, every part, every source, every date. The log began in 1971 and was still being maintained in 2023, Volume 3 of 3, in the same format Walt had used for 52 years. When Brett Hollis opened his machinery dealership in 2019 and started his campaign to get Walt into a new machine, he was arguing against 52 years of documented, intimate mechanical knowledge. He didn't know this. He thought he was arguing about resale value. Brett's first pitch was at the Co-op in the summer of 2019. He caught Walt at the grain elevator, harvest season, a dozen farmers waiting to unload, and opened with the trade-in offer before Walt had said hello. Tell you what, Walt, I'll put a credit on a new compact utility against the farmall. Call it $200. He said it with the easy generosity of a man who expects the number to be irrelevant because the new machine sells itself. Walt said, 200. Brett said, it's a fair number for what it is. You'd be surprised what I can do on the new unit price. Walt said, I'll let you know, and drove forward when the line moved. Brett told the story at the feed store that week. He told it with warmth, not malicious, just the comfortable storytelling of a man who considers himself the authority on what things are worth. The farmall became a running character in Brett's stories, the antique, the museum piece, the thing Walt won't let go of. The story improved with each telling. By August at the grain elevator, the farmall had stalled crossing the county road, and Walt had pushed it to the shoulder. By the county fair, the engine had stalled twice, and Walt had pushed it half a mile in the heat. None of this had happened. The farmall had never left Walt stranded anywhere. But the story lived in the county's social atmosphere the way these stories do. Loose and self-reinforcing, feeding on the people who laughed. Walt heard the versions. He drove home from the county fair where Brett had told the stalling story to a group of farmers near the equipment display. And he went to the farmall in the shed and sat on the seat for a moment in the dark. Then he got his notebook and opened it to the current page and wrote the date and the entry. Oil change due. Carburetor adjustment. Checkpoints gap. He went through each item in order. He did what was real and left the story where it was. At the grain elevator in August 2022, harvest season, a dozen farmers waiting, Brett told the stalling story again. Walt was 3 spots back in the line, within easy earshot. He didn't look over. He drove forward when the line moved. That evening he oiled the carburetor and checked the points gap and recorded it in the log. This was not stubbornness. This was the discipline of 50 years. You respond to what is real. You don't waste motion on what someone says about it. Brett visited the farm in September 2022 with a brochure and a new trade-in quote. He drove in the driveway and handed the brochure across Walt's kitchen table as if making a charitable donation. The trade-in value he penciled in for the farmall was $250, not as a machine, as scrap steel by weight, at a rate he calculated from the local salvage yard. $250. Circled in the margin. Walt's kitchen smelled of coffee and machine oil. The table had a crack Walt had filled with wood putty in 1989. Walt looked at the $250, looked at Brett, and said, I'll think about it. Brett drove away. Walt put the brochure in the toolbox beside the maintenance log. It would make a useful fire starter. He went back to his October prep work. You've met someone like Brett, haven't you? The man who means well enough, but who has decided what something is worth before he's looked at it, and who lacks the imagination to consider that his pricing model might be missing a variable. Brett's model was the used equipment market, the machine's condition, its age, its resale comps. He ran every machine through the same variables and arrived at a number and was confident in the number. He had never included in his variables the specific, accumulated knowledge of the man who had maintained a machine for 52 years. He didn't know that variable existed. He thought maintenance was maintenance. You either did it or you didn't. He didn't know that there was a difference between the maintenance that kept a machine running and the maintenance that made a machine better than it had ever been. Walt's Farmall was better than it had ever been. In late September 2023, the week before harvest, Brett ran into Walt at the co-op and delivered what he clearly meant as a final, benevolent word. He said it in front of Len McGuire and a younger farmer named Kyle Peterson, who had heard all of Brett's versions of the Farmall story and had incorporated them into his understanding of Walt as a kind of harmless eccentric. "Walt, I'm going to be straight with you," Brett said. His voice had the warmth of a man who has resigned himself to a difficult truth. When that machine quits in the middle of a field, and it will, at some point, because they all do, you're going to need someone to come pull you out. I just want to make sure you've thought about what that looks like. Walt looked at him. Len was quiet. Kyle nodded. The way you nod when you've already decided the other person is right. Walt thanked Brett for his concern. He bought his co-op supplies. He drove home. That evening he checked the October weather forecast. Probability of rain on the 2nd, 94%. He made a note in the log. At a county farm bureau meeting in early September, Brett had made an informal pitch for what he called a modern equipment cooperative, a cost-sharing pool for newer machines among smaller operators. He framed it partly as a safety argument. Older equipment was a liability in emergency situations. The county extension agent made a note. Several farmers looked at each other. Walt was not at the meeting. Len attended and reported back. Walt heard it and said nothing for a long time. "Then, he'll need pulling before I do." It was not a boast. It was a calendar. The October 2nd rain forecast turned out to be wrong in the most specific possible way. The rain came 3 hours earlier than predicted. It fell harder than the forecast. And it fell on ground that was already at 80% field capacity from a wet September. Ground that had no room left to absorb anything. By 5 a.m. on October 3rd, the low ground in 3 contiguous fields was a clay trap. The clay in Fort County has a particular character. It takes water fast and gives it back slowly, and in the meantime, it becomes a substance with the adhesive properties of setting concrete. Machines that drove in at 30% moisture sank as the clay absorbed and swelled around the tires. By 6:30 a.m., Brett's lead sales rep had tried and failed to drive a brand new 120 horsepower utility tractor off the low ground. Both demonstration units were buried, the machines Brett had staged overnight for a Saturday, showing to a group of prospective buyers who would now have a different kind of show entirely. 2 neighboring hired hands tractors were in the same section, also stuck. Calls went out across the county. Brett called his tow company. The tow company said the access road was impassable for a heavy wrecker. Earliest availability, 2 p.m. At 7 a.m., Len McGuire called Walt. Walt was already awake. He had been awake since 4:30, checking the forecast updates and looking at the field. He had pulled on his jacket and walked to the shed and checked the Farmall's tire pressure by hand. He had done this because he had been watching the October weather forecast since the first week of September, and he had known, with the particular certainty of a man who has farmed the same ground for 52 years, that this rain was coming. He had rebuilt the rear differential 2 Saturdays ago, because he knew that if the differential was not at full specification when this rain came, there would be a moment when he would wish it had been. Len called. Walt said he'd be there at 7:15. He was there at 7:15. The Farmall's exhaust stack sent a grey puff into the cold, wet air. The engine turned over with the sound of a machine that knows exactly what it's doing, a direct injection diesel with no electronics to fail, no sensors to short, no modules to override. Just the clean mechanical music of a properly maintained four-cylinder working at specification. Brett was already at the field edge. He had arrived 20 minutes earlier and had been standing in the cold with his arms crossed and his demonstration machines behind him in the clay, and his morning going very badly. He saw the Farmall coming and said what he said. Walt did not answer. He climbed down from the seat, picked up the chain from the hitch, and walked to the nearest stuck machine, one of Brett's demonstration units, a machine that cost, retail, $340,000. He hooked the chain to the drawbar with the economy of a man who has done this specific motion many times. He climbed back up. He set the throttle. He let the clutch out. The Farmall's rear wheels found grip in a way that is difficult to explain unless you have watched a properly calibrated 71-year-old machine with rebuilt differentials and correct tire pressure working in the kind of ground it was designed to work in. It did not spin wildly and dig itself in. It found the friction and used it. The chain went taut. There was a moment, a held breath, the clay resisting, and then the stuck machine began to move. Slowly, steadily, with a sound like the earth releasing something it had decided to keep. The first machine was free in 11 minutes. Brett said nothing. The second machine took 9 minutes. The third took 14. It was the deepest, buried to the frame on the driver's side, and Walt had to reposition twice and make 2 partial pulls before the angle was right. Nobody offered to help with the repositioning. Nobody said anything at all. They watched. The county extension agent, a man named Paul Reiter, who had been in the area for a routine farm visit and had heard about the stuck machines on the radio, arrived at the field edge at 9:00 a.m. During the 5th pull, he pulled out a notepad. By 9:40 a.m., all 6 machines were on dry ground. Walt shut off the Farmall, climbed down and unhooked the chain. He coiled it back on the hitch with the same efficiency he'd used to hook it. He did not look at Brett. Paul Reiter walked over. He asked Walt how old the tractor was. 71 years, Walt said. Built in 52. How long have you had it? 52 years. Paul made a note. He asked if he could photograph the maintenance log. Walt opened the toolbox on the Farmall's right side and handed him the yellow legal pad notebook, Volume 3, covering 2004 to the present. Paul leafed through it. Every page, every entry in the same format for 52 years. Can I borrow this? Paul said. You can photograph it, Walt said. Len McGuire had been recording on his phone since Machine 1. He had the whole sequence, the chain hooking, the wheels finding grip, the clay releasing, Brett's face during Machine 3. He did not post it anywhere. He gave it to the county extension office for their newsletter. Brett's Saturday equipment demonstration was cancelled. The machines needed cleaning and servicing before they could be shown to anyone. His 2 sales reps spent the afternoon with pressure washers. The prospective buyers were called and rescheduled. Brett did not speak for the 2 hours of the pull operation. He stood at the field edge and watched every run. At one point, during the 7th run, while Walt was doing the routine hydraulic temperature check he always did at that interval, Brett walked over and asked, without preamble, where Walt had sourced the hydraulic lines. Walt reached into the toolbox and handed him the log. "Page 47, he said. "Hydraulic system, 2019, Brett read the page. He turned to page 48. He turned again. He kept reading for 20 minutes while Walt finished the temperature check and got back on the seat. The rental tractor Brett had promised arrived at 8:15 p.m. 12 hours after Len McGuire had called Walt. 8 hours and 35 minutes after Walt's Farmall had made the first pull. The County Extension Office newsletter ran a piece the following week with Len's photograph. The Farmall mid-pull, chain taut, mud spray behind the rear wheels, all 6 of Brett's machines visible in the background, free on the headland. The caption read simply, 1952 Farmall M, Ford County. The article mentioned Walt by name and described the 3-hour, 12-minute operation. It did not mention that the machines that needed pulling were Brett's demonstration fleet. It didn't need to. 3 of the younger farmers who had watched the pull stopped by Walt's farm in the days that followed. Not to buy anything. Not to discuss anything. Just to look at the Farmall up close. 2 of them asked to see the maintenance log. Walt showed them every page. At the end of the following week, Paul Reiter from the Extension Office included the log in a regional presentation on equipment reliability standards. He showed 3 pages on the projection screen, the 1989 rear axle repair, the 2019 hydraulic overhaul, and the October 2023 differential rebuild. He talked about what the log represented. Not just maintenance, but the accumulated mechanical intelligence of a man who had committed to understanding one machine completely over 52 years. He did not show Brett's face during Machine 3. He didn't need to. The day of the pull ended quietly. Walt drove the Farmall back to his shed. He parked it in the same spot it had occupied since 1971. More or less, the exact spot shifted a few feet over the years as the shed had been modified, but always the same wall, always the same orientation. He shut it off. He climbed down. He opened the toolbox and took out the yellow legal pad notebook. He turned to the current page. He wrote the entry for October 3rd, 6 pulls. Rear differential, nominal. Hydraulic temp, nominal. Tire pressure, nominal after operation. Engine hours, logged, 0 issues. He closed the notebook. He put it back in the toolbox. He turned off the shed light and walked back to the house. The serial number plate on the Farmall's dash was polished clean. Walt had polished it in September during the pre-season maintenance. Not because anyone was going to see it. Because it was there. You know someone like Walt, maybe. The person who does the work correctly without announcing that they're doing it correctly. Who keeps the records because the records are what the truth requires. Who listens to the story being told about them. The version where the tractor stalled on the county road. The version where it stalled twice and goes home and checks the points gap and enters it in the log. The gap between what Brett thought the Farmall was worth and what it actually was worth had nothing to do with the machine. It had to do with the variable Brett had never put in his equation. The 52 years of knowledge in a yellow legal pad notebook. The rebuilt differential, the tire pressure checked by hand at 4:30 in the morning, because a man who had been watching the weather since September knew this day was coming. Scrap stays scrap. But this machine was never scrap. It was always what a man who understood it completely decided to make it. And on the day when that decision mattered most, when 6 modern machines were buried in Ford County clay and the rental company was 4 hours away, it was the only thing that could answer. Brett Hollis did not mention the Farmall in his showroom. He didn't need to. The story had already moved through the county without his help. The way these stories do. Quietly, thoroughly, and without a way back. Tell me in the comments, have you ever seen an old machine do something a new one couldn't? Or kept something running that everyone told you to replace? I want to hear it. Share this with someone who works on old iron. Someone who's been told their machine isn't relevant anymore. They'll understand every word of it. Like the video if you made it this far. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. These stories are everywhere if you know where to look. Next time, the Texas Hill Country, a 1957 Alice Chalmers WD-45, and the dealer who offered $800 for it as scrap. The number the judge read aloud in front of the crowd at the fair, $38,000. There was a year, 2020, when Walt's operation nearly gave Brett a piece of evidence he'd been waiting for. The hydraulic pump on the Farmall developed a slow weep at the main seal. Not a failure, a weep. 2 drops of oil per hour at full operating pressure. Walt found it on a Saturday morning during a routine check before the planting season, running his fingers along the pump housing the way a doctor runs hands along a patient's side looking for tenderness. He drove to the parts supplier in Champaign and ordered the seal kit. He drove back. He replaced the seal on Tuesday. He bled the system, ran it at operating pressure for 2 hours while he watched the housing, and entered the result in the notebook: seal replaced, no weep, system nominal. The Farmall never knew it had a problem. Brett would have called it a sign. Walt called it maintenance. The distinction is the whole story. In that same spring of 2020, Brett sold Kyle Peterson a new utility tractor, 92 horsepower, GP's guidance package, full warranty. Kyle was happy. The machine was good. Brett was right that it was good. He was not wrong that modern equipment had real advantages: precision, comfort, diagnostics, dealer support. He was wrong about only one thing, which was the assumption that these advantages made the alternative worthless. They didn't. They made the alternative different. And different is not worthless. But Brett's business model depended on the alternative being worthless. So he kept telling the story. Kyle Peterson was at the field edge on October 3rd. He had come to watch the demonstration machines get stuck and had ended up watching something else entirely. He stood at the headland during Machine 4 and Machine 5 and Machine 6 and said very little. Afterward, he drove past Walt's farm on the county road. He did it on purpose, he admitted to Len later, and looked at the Farmall shed through the fence. Len called Walt that evening and told him about Kyle. Walt said, "Good kid, he'll figure it out." He meant nothing specific by it. He just meant that a person who watches carefully enough eventually sees what's there. The maintenance log covered, at the time of the pull, 2,847 individual entries over 52 years. Every oil change, every filter, every gasket and seal and bearing and bushing, every adjustment, every calibration, every replacement, every source of parts. Walt had sourced components from 7 different states over the years. A carburetor rebuild kit from a specialist in Minnesota. An ignition point set from a restoration supplier in Ohio. the hydraulic lines from a fabricator in Indiana who still made them to the original specification because there were enough people who still needed them. The total parts cost over 52 years, approximately $8,200. The labor, Walt's own, at whatever rate you valued a man's time spent doing work he found meaningful and satisfying. The machine's purchase price in 1971, $400. Brett's quote for a comparable working use tractor in 2019, $28,500. The arithmetic is not complicated. But arithmetic is not the point. The point is that Walt knew the machine completely, which meant the machine never surprised him, which meant he was never caught unprepared, which meant that on the morning the county needed something to run in Ford County Clay, he was already awake and already looking at the weather and already checking the tire pressure, because he had done this for 52 years, and the preparation was inseparable from the machine. You cannot buy that at a dealership. You can only build it over time. The Farmall serial number was K117482. Walt could read it on the plate on the dash from the seat. He had polished that plate in September, part of the pre-season cleanup he did every year, whether the machine needed cleaning or not, because the discipline of the log and the discipline of the maintenance were the same discipline, and you didn't practice it only when it was convenient. The October morning on the field, when Paul Reiter asked Walt how old the machine was, Walt said, 71 years, built in 52. He said it plainly, without pride, without the particular satisfaction of a man who has been waiting to say something. He said it the way you state a fact when someone asks for a fact. Paul wrote it down. The newsletter ran the photograph on the front page of the County Extension Bulletin. The Farmall midpull, chain taut, mud spray fanning out behind the rear wheels, the horizon flat and gray behind it. Not a beautiful photograph. It was taken on lens phone in cold weather through a dirty lens. But it showed what happened, which was the only thing that mattered. Brett saw the newsletter. He was in his showroom when it arrived, and he picked it up from the front desk stack and read it standing up, without sitting down. He read the caption, 1952, Farmall M. Ford County, and he read the description of the operation. He set the newsletter down on the front desk and went back to his office. He didn't say anything about it to his sales reps. He didn't say anything about it to anyone. What he thought, standing in his office, nobody knows. What he felt, maybe he himself couldn't have named. But something had changed in the equation. He had been selling against the old iron for 2 seasons, and the old iron had answered. And the answer was in the County Extension Bulletin and on 40 phones that had been photographing the pull from different angles, and it was going to be in the county's memory for a long time. Walt was in his shop that same morning, working on a minor carburetor adjustment he'd been planning since the September checkup. The Farmall was back in its spot. The log was in the toolbox. The serial number plate was polished. The work was done. The log said so. Everything else was beside the point. When someone hands you the one thing that works and tells you it's worthless, remember the Farmall. Remember the log. Remember October 3rd at 7:15 a.m. The chain going taut, the clay releasing its grip, and a 71-year-old machine doing exactly what 52 years of knowledge had prepared it to do. The machine doesn't know what Brett thinks. It only knows what Walt built into it. That's enough. Tell me in the comments, have you kept something running that everyone told you to replace? Old equipment, old methods, something people wrote off before they understood it? I read everything. Share this with someone who works on old iron, someone who has been told the thing they love isn't relevant anymore. This is for them. Like if you made it this far. Subscribe. The next story involves a 1957 Alice Chalmers WD-45, a Texas Hill Country widow, and a dealer who offered $800 for a machine a judge later valued at $38,000. You won't want to miss it. The 1989 rear axle repair was the one Walt talked about when he talked about the Farmall et al., which was rarely, and only when directly asked. The housing had cracked, a stress fracture along the inner bore, invisible until the axle started running hot on the left side, which Walt noticed during a routine post-field check when he put his hand on the housing and found it 15 degrees hotter than the right side. He took the machine to a retired machinist named Harold in Gibson City who had worked on agricultural equipment since the 1960s and who had a bore and hone set up in his shop that he had never been willing to sell. Harold looked at the housing for 3 minutes, ran his hand along the bore, and said, "We can fix this." He said it with the calm certainty of a man who has fixed things like this before. They spent 3 weekends on the job. Harold rebored the housing, re-sleeved it to original specification, and finish-honed it to a tolerance that exceeded the factory spec. Walt installed new bearings on both sides while they had it open. Total parts cost $183. Total time, 3 weekends and 2 Tuesday evenings. A dealer would have charged $4,000 for the repair. Walt entered it in the log with 2 lines: axle housing cracked L side, rebored and re-sleeved, new bearings both sides. Harold Menzies, Gibson City. $183 parts. Harold died in 2001. Walt attended the funeral. He was the only person from outside Harold's family who came, which surprised him. Harold had fixed a lot of machines for a lot of people. He had thought there would be more. He wrote Harold's name in the log when he got home. Not as an entry, there was nothing to record. Just the name and the date. Harold Menzies, December 14th, 2001. He thought Harold would have found that an acceptable sort of memorial. This was the machine Brett Hollis was calling worthless. The machine that Harold had helped save, that Walt had kept alive across 5 decades, that had been rebuilt from the block up when the weather model said 94% rain probability on October 2nd, and Walt had known, not guessed, not hoped, known that the low ground was going to trap everything that wasn't prepared for it. Brett had 6 machines in that field, all of them modern, all of them stuck. All of them waiting for a heavy wrecker that wasn't coming until 2 p.m. Walt had 1 machine. It was 71 years old. It had 2,847 entries in a yellow legal pad notebook and a polished serial number plate, and a rear differential that had been rebuilt 2 Saturdays ago, and a man on its seat who had been watching the weather since September. It made every pull. 6 machines, 3 hours and 12 minutes, 0 issues. The last thing Walt did before he drove home was check the Farmall's oil. Not because he was worried. The oil pressure gauge had read normal through every pull, which was one of the things you checked at every interval when you knew your machine. He checked it because he always checked it at the end of a sustained operation, and 52 years of always was not going to stop on the day people were watching. The oil was full, clean, exactly where it was supposed to be. He wrote it in the log. Then, he drove home. The week after the pull, the county extension office released the full newsletter. 1,400 copies distributed to every agricultural address in Ford County. The Farmall photograph on page 1. Walt Briggs's name in the 3rd paragraph. The words 1952 Farmall M in the caption, larger than the surrounding text. 3 younger farmers stopped by the farm in the first week. Kyle Peterson among them. Kyle pulled into the driveway in his new utility tractor, which struck Walt as exactly the right way to arrive, and asked if he could look at the farmall up close. Walt said yes. Kyle spent 40 minutes going over the machine, the engine, the differentials, the hydraulics, the footrest, where Walt had done a welded repair in the mid-90s. He asked good questions, not the questions of someone looking for flaws, the questions of someone trying to understand how the machine worked and why it still worked. Walt answered everything. He showed Kyle the maintenance log. He showed him the hydraulic page and the differential page and the carburetor entries going back to 1978. Kyle turned pages slowly, reading the entries, running his thumb along the columns. At one point, Kyle looked up and said, "You could have just bought a new tractor." Walt thought about that. "Could have," he said. "But you didn't." "No. Why not?" Walt looked at the farmall for a moment. He had been asked this, in various forms, for 52 years. He had never had a satisfying answer for people who didn't already understand it. He tried the simplest version, "Because I knew this one." Kyle nodded. He looked at the farmall again, then at the log. "Knowing something," he said, "costs time." "Yes," Walt said. Kyle stayed another 20 minutes, asking about the rear axle repair and the seal replacements. He drove home in his new utility tractor and thought about what knowing something costs, which was a different kind of thinking than he had done the week before. Len McGuire called Walt the Friday after the newsletter came out. He said 3 farmers from Livingston County had called the extension office asking about the tractor and the maintenance methodology. Walt said, "Tell them to come by." Len said he would. 2 of them came the following Saturday. Walt showed them the log. He did not show them as a lesson. He showed them because people asked to see it, and the thing was there to see. You don't hide a log. The newsletter photograph ended up on the county extension office wall. Paul Reiter framed it and hung it in the hallway by the conference room. The farmall midpull, chain tote, mud spray, gray October sky. Underneath it he put a small printed caption, 1952 Farmall M. Ford County, Illinois, October 3rd, 2023, 71 years old. 3 hours 12 minutes. 6 machines recovered. 0 mechanical issues. Brett Hollis drove past the extension office building twice in the week after the newsletter. He did not stop. Walt did not know about the framed photograph until the following spring, when he stopped at the extension office about a soil testing matter and saw it in the hallway. He looked at it for a moment. He recognized the chain angle from machine 3, the difficult one, where he'd had to reposition twice. He went into the conference room and asked about the soil test. He said nothing about the photograph. He drove home and checked the farmall's oil. Then he checked the tire pressure. Then he entered the date and the service notation in the log. Then he put the log back in the toolbox and closed it. The machine was ready for next season. It was always ready for next season. That was the point. You can be told something is worth $200. You can be told it is a museum piece, an embarrassment, a thing that will strand you in a field and give the man who doubted it a satisfying story to tell. You can hear all of that and still know what you know. The machine doesn't hear the story. It only knows what you've done to it, and what you've done to it is what it can do for you. That arithmetic closes every argument. 52 years. $400. A yellow legal pad notebook. A polished serial number plate. And on October 3rd, in the cold wet morning, a chain going taut in Ford County clay. Everything else is just a story people tell before the chain moves.